Jordan would be at the back going, Jerry Krause! Jerry Krause! This bus went a lot faster yesterday without your fat ass on it.
Alright, so I'm going to let this play through and I'll add my 2 cents at the end.
Jerry Krause has his ego. The owner has his ego. Jackson has his ego. Jordan has his ego.
Michael wanted the power, Phil wanted the power. Krause had the power.
I don't think Reinsdorf knew much about basketball, and I think Krause was his basketball brain. And given those circumstances, I think he couldn't do anything but give Krause all the say and all the power as far as the basketball went.
And the only real decisions, of course, that I made were to get people who knew what they were doing so I could stand out of the way and let them get their jobs done.
The struggle for all that power began in March of 1985 when Jerry Reinsdorf, the new owner of the Bulls, hired Jerry Krause. By the next season, the new vice president of basketball operations and the star player were at each other's throats.
Very early in Michael's second season with the team, of course, he injured his foot, and that was Krause's first full season as general manager, and that entire scenario just created the nightmare that would become the Jordan-Krause relationship.
We sent Michael to 3 specialists around the country, and all 3 of them told me that there was probably an 80-90% chance he could get re-injured. Well, I didn't want to send him out there. I kept listening to doctors. Doctors kept telling me not to send him out there. Michael wanted to play more, and that's the kind of competitor he is.
They go to these meetings with the doctors. Jordan had said what the doctors said, and it wasn't what the team said. So next time, the Krause shows up with a tape recorder, and Jordan got furious about this. Said he, in effect implied he didn't believe him. So then they have another session, and now Jordan shows up with a tape recorder, and he says, I want to tape Krause because he's lying. They just don't want me to play because they want to miss the playoffs again. They want to get a high draft pick. It just got worse from there.
Jerry Krause, according to Michael, stepped in and said, you'll do as we say, you're our property.
And Michael, years later, remembered that as saying, that was when I knew I was in a business.
I tried to be as sensitive as I could to Michael. By the same token, I had a responsibility to our franchise and to the people that were paying me. And it's probably the most difficult situation I've gone through.
Like most head-on collisions, Michael won. He played.
Michael is still immature, so I don't know necessarily that he was fair. I felt like Michael made a mistake to come back, and he could have jeopardized not only the franchise future, but his own future.
Jordan propelled the Bulls into the playoffs, where he scored an NBA postseason record 63 points against the Celtics. But the acrimony between player and VP increased 2 years later when Krause traded Jordan's friend Charles Oakley for center Bill Cartwright.
I told Michael we would inform him of everything we were doing, which he deserved. And he was at a fight that night in Vegas, the night we made the trade. And I couldn't get to him. And the trade was announced, and he got a little excited. And that's fine. He didn't understand Bill, didn't know Bill. We thought that trade could turn us into a champion. And luckily enough, it worked out that way.
But even a championship followed by another one and then a third couldn't heal the rift between Jordan and Krause.
Michael wondered, why is this short guy the general manager of the Chicago Bulls to dictate what we are to be doing? I think he just had a kind of a resentment. He did feel that Jerry was trying to take a little bit more credit probably than he deserved.
Jerry believes he never got enough credit as a scout for finding talent, and nobody ever knew who Jerry Krause was before he became a general manager. And I think once in that position, he decided, well, now it's time. It's my time.
Jerry, with all of his tales, loves to regale people about his scouting accomplishments and how he stood up to get Sloan and Earl the Pearl Monroe, who were not household names, but tales like that would just set Michael Jordan off.
Michael began making fun of him more and more in front of the media. And then it started getting meaner, and you wondered where it came from. It was stuff like Scottie Pippen. Very innocently, after the first title, seeing a replica of the NBA trophy on Jerry's desk and admiring it and asking if he could get one made. And Jerry saying, absolutely not. That's only for the captains. And then later bragging to me about it that, he wouldn't let Scottie do it. I mean, why?
The personal insecurities that Jerry sometimes has, his ability to irritate people, to be brusque, as Phil said, all of those things factor in.
He alienated so many people. I mean, he just has such a horrible way about him that it's always easy to say he brought it on himself, but he doesn't know how to behave any differently.
One day we were on the bus, and Michael said from the back of the bus, "Jerry, you can go fishing tomorrow. They got a lot of lakes out here." He said, "Don't worry about it if you don't catch anything. You can always eat the bait." So everybody on the bus was like laughing.
I'm not one to criticize somebody who's paying me pretty well to play or coach basketball. I think it's silly. I think it's silly, and I think it's a waste of energy.
If I'm the owner, I'm getting in the middle and saying, Michael, would you stop the crap here? Reinsdorf never did that. He allowed all this to fester.
Whatever Jerry Krause did it seemed destined to be fodder for Michael Jordan's motivation. But it really reached a high in the fall of '97 on press day. Krause said, "I don't care if we go 82-0. Phil's not coming back."
That statement was very indicative of how their relationship was at that time. Only an angry man would say something like that.
Krause could have stayed up in his office that day, but he came down into the Berto Center where there were just numbers of camera crews, and he said, "It's not just players who win championships, organizations do."
Without the word alone in it, would have been an arrogant statement to make. But the statement I made was alone. I said players and coaches alone don't win, and that's true. And I believe that to this day. I'll believe it all my life. I think you have to have an organization that wins. Our secretaries in the office get rings. They get the same rings that everybody else gets.
That's a heck of a comment to make when, you know, we've got guys in the trenches every single day in practice and every single night in these games that are doing it. Secretaries and stuff aren't out there making big shots.
That was a slap to the players on that team. And I think Michael took that very, very hard.
It's a bad way to end an unbelievable run.
Michael reiterated that this will be his final season if Phil Jackson doesn't come back.
It wasn't that Michael loved Phil so much that he was going to go down with the ship. He hated Krause so much that Michael was willing to place his principles on the table and say, I won't play anymore if you fire my coach or run him out of town.
He had this insatiable desire to still play basketball. He hopes that it turns around, that at some point they can work it out and Phil will stay there, and he really held tight to that. And then, when it didn't happen, you know, that was probably the worst day of his career, because then he was forced to retire.
If Michael Jordan had not retired, I don't have any doubt in my mind that we would have had an awfully good chance of winning another championship. But once Michael retired,
we talked about what we were going to do. Can we bring the rest of this group back and win with it? And it was an easy decision for me, and the answer was no.
In a tumultuous two-week period in January of 1999, Reinsdorf and Krause dismantled the championship Bulls. Jordan retired. Free agent Scottie Pippen was re-signed and traded to Houston. Steve Kerr and Luke Longley were traded, and Dennis Rodman declared himself done with basketball.
Jerry Reinsdorf and Jerry Krause were sick and tired of being portrayed as riding number 23's coattails. They thought they had earned the right to start it over and build it in their, or Jerry Krause's, image.
Jerry felt like he had something to prove to himself, that he could do it. I think that he relished that challenge and wanted it.
I think people thought I relished it more than I actually did. At that time, I wasn't about ready to quit and go home.
And the first day of training camp started with us having 4 players. We had players coming from all parts of the United States that had to go through physicals and sign contracts. We didn't have enough players to open camp. The once mighty Bulls were laughed at now.
The team were going after the Bulls because of those days. They were just actually still pissed and miserable for the things the Bulls did to them.
The Bulls setting a new record for offensive futility.
I remember us playing Miami Heat and scoring 59 points in a game. I remember players running by our bench. Where's Michael and Scottie now?
After losing 102 games and winning only 30 in the first 2 years without MJ and the Jordanaires, the Bulls thought they had lined up their savior in the summer of 2000, the extraordinarily talented Tracy McGrady, then a free agent.
I think the saddest moment I've had in many years was when Tracy told me no. He had indicated to us that he was coming, and that was a very tough moment for me.
If I was the outsider, not knowing what is going on, and if I hear all these stories, I would say, I'm not going there. If Michael is not happy in there, I'm not going to be happy at all.
If they crapped on the best player to ever play the game, then why would I want to go there? I just feel like Chicago, the management there is all about them. And unfortunately, players wins championships, not management.
If Jordan couldn't help the Bulls on the court, couldn't he have served them off the court? Apparently, no attempt was even made at reconciliation.
The sports crime of the century is that Michael didn't finish out his playing career in Chicago and then gracefully segue into the front office.
If anything was going to happen in Chicago, Jerry Reinsdorf would have had to got in touch with Michael and presented an opportunity.
What Michael Jordan wanted was a piece of the franchise. He wanted to be ahead of Krause in the hierarchy.
Ownership level was never discussed. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't think my job was discussed, and that's the way it is.
One admirable quality in Reinsdorf, although it probably did not do the Bulls organization very much good, he's a loyal guy, and he believes that Jerry Krause did a lot to build that dynasty. He's not going to just cast him aside, not even for Michael Jordan.
Why does he stay loyal to Jerry Krause? Krause has taken his bullets for him over the years because Jerry Reinsdorf very shrewdly has stayed out of the crossfire. And now, Jerry Krause, I hate to use this word, and I don't use it lightly, but he will go down as the most hated man in the history of Chicago sports, which is exactly what he didn't want.
Okay, so next up, we're going to examine some of the other parties that were responsible for the demise of the Bulls.
Now, in this show, we'll count down the reasons why you can't blame Jerry Krause for the demise of the Chicago Bulls after their incredible run of 6 NBA championships in 8 years. First, let's take a look back at the evidence against him.
Jordan a drive, hangs, fires, scores! He scores! Oh my goodness!
Every single night that you watched Michael Jordan, he was Michael freaking Jordan every single time.
It was just astounding, just for the sheer beauty of what he did on the floor and the sheer success of what he did. Made all of our lives brighter.
There was a certain excitement about the team. There was a certain rock star mentality about the team.
It was great. If one night one of us didn't have it, you could never tell. We were able to feed off of each other and find a way to get ourselves going.
The Bulls of the 90s were probably, without question, one of the 3 best teams in the history of the NBA.
When you win 6 championships, especially 3 in a row, I think you would consider that particular team a dynasty.
But the wonderful ride would end in abrupt bitterness. Just a week after Michael Jordan nailed the Bulls' 6th title and 2nd three-peat in June of 1998, Phil Jackson confirmed he wouldn't re-sign as head coach. By January of 1999, Jordan and Scottie Pippen were also gone. Standing amid the rubble of the collapsed dynasty was the Bulls' vice president of basketball operations, Jerry Krause.
He alienated so many people. I mean, he just has such a horrible way about him.
He's not a very personable guy. He's not very media friendly. He really knows how to put his foot in his mouth.
The personal insecurities that Jerry sometimes has, his ability to irritate people, to be brusque, all of those things factor in.
He is blamed for destroying the team because he allowed his ego to intervene between the team, the coach, and all the people involved.
If Krause qualified as a scapegoat, he was also a major architect of the team that dominated the 1990s. But, like Rodney Dangerfield, he got no respect.
That's all Jerry wants, is to be accepted and to be loved and to get some credit. He's always kind of had an inferiority complex his entire life and his entire career.
I think Jerry believes he never got enough credit as a scout for finding talent, and nobody ever knew who Jerry Krause was before he became a general manager. And I think once in that position, he decided, well, now it's time. It's my time.
He was the guy who took public jabs at Phil Jackson.
I think Jerry resented the fact that Phil got so much of the credit when he had hired Phil in the first place.
He was basically a buffoon who was riding the coattails of Michael Jordan while representing himself as the brains behind Michael Jordan.
During Media Day in October of 1997, Krause went public with his feelings by saying, "Organizations win championships."
To me, that sort of epitomized what happened with the Bulls and why the run ended.
I think it was a slap to the players on that team. And I think Michael took that very, very hard.
He's the greatest player ever. He deserved the credit, and yet from his perspective, here's Jerry Krause trying to get credit and saying organizations win championships.
As discontent festered, the Jordan-Jackson alliance strengthened.
Jerry Krause and I were, really having difficulties working together. And Jerry really wanted me out, and he wanted to start over again and to begin anew.
Michael hated Krause so much that Michael was willing to place his principles on the table and say, I won't play anymore if you fire my coach or run him out of town.
He hopes that it turns around, that at some point they can work it out and Phil will stay there, and he really held tight to that. And then, when it didn't happen, that was probably the worst day of his career.
I am here to announce my retirement from the game of basketball.
Michael Jordan never wanted to retire. He didn't want to leave. His hand was forced by Jerry Krause.
It is a tragedy that he allowed Michael to get away. Jerry Krause thought that the only way he could preserve any kind of place in history was to build a team from scratch, without Phil Jackson, without Michael Jordan.
He truly wanted to wipe that slate clean after 6 championships and start it over in his image and prove that he could win a ring by himself.
When the dust of defection had settled, the Bulls were gelded of championship talent. They failed to make the playoffs the next 6 seasons.
After Krause dismantled the team became a civic joke, a civic embarrassment. It was every Chicagoan's dystopian nightmare. Things went from bad to worse to worse.
Jerry Krause will go down as the most hated man in the history of Chicago sports, which is exactly what he didn't want.
You've just seen why Jerry Krause is blamed for the fall of the Bulls. We're going to count down the top 5 reasons you can't blame Jerry Krause later in the show. But here are a few additional reasons why you can't fault Krause. We call them the best of the rest. A lust for credit.
I remember talking to B.J. Armstrong and Scottie Pippen. Somebody asked Scottie, what do you think the legacy of this team is going to be? And then the smile that was on his face just totally disappeared. And he said, all they're going to remember is Michael winning championships.
You have volatile egos run amok. You have championship banners hanging everywhere. And you have everybody wanting credit in some way, shape, or form for their part of that banner.
I think that really explains a lot when you look at why that team broke up.
I defy you to find me somebody who could have come in and kept that thing together with all those diverse personalities and egos.
Another best of the rest. Attrition. 10 Bulls became free agents after the 1998 season.
I think ultimately the reason the Bulls were broken apart was because everybody's contract ended in '98. I think it was unrealistic to expect the team to all of a sudden just say, sure, we'll put together a $100 million payroll and try to win one more championship.
We could have kept all of them by signing them to multi-year contracts, but we would then have been locked into mediocrity because of the NBA salary cap. If we had kept all of these guys around, we would not have been able to get better.
Reason number 5 is the defendant in this case, Jerry Krause. He delivered quality goods.
It's unfair for the city to hate Jerry Krause and dismiss him as a bumbling idiot. He put 6 championship teams on the floor. Who else did that?
Aside from Michael Jordan,
he was the most valuable person. I mean, he assembled that team. Year after year, he assembled it, and then he reassembled it, and he filled in the holes, and he brought in the pieces, and that was all Krause.
When Krause was hired as vice president of basketball operations in March of 1985, the Bulls, who had made the playoffs once in 7 seasons, were a pedestrian band with one brilliant soloist.
We had a bad ball club and a young man named Jordan and 11 guys we didn't want, and we had to rebuild that, to totally turn that thing around.
Every single component that contributed to each of the 6 championships was provided by Jerry Krause, starting with Phil Jackson himself.
There was a plan there that he followed that worked perfectly.
The genius of Jerry Krause was in finding players who would be better playing with Michael Jordan than they would be anyplace else.
Krause was able to complement him with Bill Cartwright. Defense, rebounding, and Cartwright was a special kind of personality that affected the rest of the team.
Horace Grant became one of the Bulls' Dobermans, one of the key people in their pressure defense, one of the key people in their rebounding.
There was some tremendous coups. The guy who really identified and really maneuvered and moved mountains to orchestrate a deal to get Scottie Pippen was Jerry Krause.
We went after John Paxson. No one especially was interested in John Paxson. He was practically a gift to us.
Paxson for 3! Yeah! After Chicago completed its first three-peat in 1993, Michael Jordan abruptly retired in the wake of gambling allegations and his father's murder. 2 years later, when Jordan returned to the Bulls, Krause again revamped his star supporting cast.
Jordan and Pippen are the only 2 players on the second three-peat team that were on the first three-peat team. So over a couple of years, Jerry really turned the ball club over.
I think history will show that Jerry Krause needs to be given credit for putting that support staff around Jordan.
Chicago Bulls are world champions for the 6th time in the 90s.
I knew there was going to be a time where we were going to have to rebuild. It wasn't something that I relished, but at that time, I wanted to continue that team as long as we could win championships.
When the brilliant trinity of Jordan, Jackson, and Pippen went their separate ways, Krause hunkered down in the hope of crafting a new championship team.
What were you going to do? At that point, you had no Pippen, you had no Jordan, you had no Phil Jackson, you had no veteran core. The best idea was to break it down, to start over, to draft high, to save money under the cap for free agency.
You can't blame Jerry Krause because he won 6 championships in 8 years. And you win 6 championships, you don't deserve to be blamed for anything.
Did that reason grab you? If not, we've got 4 more to go. Here's reason number 4. Scottie Pippen. If Krause was unappreciated by the fans, Pippen was short-ended by the front office. Voted in 1996 as one of the NBA's 50 all-time greatest players, the 7-time All-Star complained that he was not only unappreciated, but underpaid.
Scottie said stuff like that all the time. You know, he's quitting the team. He's quitting basketball. I mean, who could be? He says, "I'm never going to wear a Bulls uniform again."
Scottie thought that he should get more respect. He thought that he should be held up on a pedestal as a superstar in the league.
The '98 season, when Pippen was out injured and angry and asking to be traded, Krause was on the bus, and Pippen was drunk at the back, screaming at Jerry Krause to trade him, and it got really ugly.
The source of Pippen's frustration was a 5-year, $18 million contract extension he signed in 1991. 3 years later, he was the Bulls' 5th highest paid player.
It was his fault. I mean, he wanted a contract that was front-loaded. So Jerry Reinsdorf held him to it, and he resented that.
Both Mr. Reinsdorf and I sat in a room with Scottie and said, "Don't sign this contract, it's going to be outmoded." And he said, "I need the security, I want the contract."
See, Scottie was immature, and he just wanted that money. And even though Reinsdorf told him that, Pippen did it.
When the Bulls refused to renegotiate his contract, Pippen began counting down his days to free agency.
Scottie wanted out. He wanted to make his big money and wanted to try to prove himself outside of the shadow of Jordan.
I think Scottie was going to go. I really believe that. I think Scottie wanted a payday. He wanted a multi-year deal. He wanted security. I think that impacts everything else.
9 days after Jordan retired, Pippen got what he wanted by signing a 5-year, $67 million contract with Chicago with the understanding he would be dealt to Houston in a sign and trade. With the Bulls' dynasty reduced to a memory, the rest of the cast dispersed throughout the league.
I ended up signing right after that with San Antonio, and Judd Bushler signed with Detroit, and Bill Wennington went to Sacramento. But Scotty's signing with Houston was probably the first domino to fall.
I think a significant amount of blame can be placed on Scottie Pippen's departure from Chicago and the downfall of the Chicago Bulls. He was a player that you could build a team around, and when he left, I think it all kind of fell apart.
Phil Jackson left. His decision not to renew his contract drove a stake into the heart of the Bulls.
The one person who might have been able to keep the dynasty together was Phil Jackson, because I think if Jackson had decided to come back, Jordan would have played for him.
Phil deserves some of the blame. I really believe that they would have stuck around for one more year. Jerry Reinsdorf would have brought them all back for one more year if Phil had given the word.
Acting in concert with Michael Jordan, Jackson over 9 seasons had created such a steely, if not insular, team mentality, there was no room for anyone from the outside, especially Jerry Krause.
One common binding element he found was that they all had this resentment on some level about something toward Krause. And he said, well, maybe we can use that.
Phil was the ringleader, and that was the most amazing thing to me about Phil, was how he was able to get these superstar players to side with him and create these perceived battles between the players and management.
Phil was motivating the team, and it's a great ploy, and it was the players against management, and it worked.
He knew how much power he had. He knew that no matter pretty much whatever he did, that he wouldn't be looked at as the bad guy. Jerry Krause and Jerry Reinsdorf would be looked at as the bad guys. And he took advantage of that power.
Jerry Krause did not break up the Bulls. Phil Jackson broke up the Bulls. Phil Jackson engineered the whole thing. They wanted Phil to come back and coach again. Jerry Reinsdorf begged him to come back and coach again, but Jackson vowed that he would coach one more year and never coach again.
Even though at the end of the season, the ownership still offered me a job, Jerry Krause and I basically had agreement that we got on far enough with each other.
I think Phil Jackson, up until the moment he got on his motorcycle and rode off into the sunset, could have said, you know what, I want to coach one more year, or I want to coach 2 more years.
Phil did walk away from his team in a lot of ways. He portrayed it as being pushed out when in fact he was moving on his own volition.
3 reasons down and 2 to go. Here's reason number 2. Jerry Reinsdorf. Out of loyalty to Krause, the Bulls owner chose not to address the impending breakup.
I have to blame the owner for this because I can think of too many owners out there who would have found a way to keep this all together. I think the fault rests with him.
It still takes an owner with some vision and some charisma to be able to bring them all back to the bargaining table each year and keep it together until it's time to dismantle it.
A hands-off owner, Reinsdorf deferred all decisions and their results to Krause.
The only real decisions, of course, that I made were to get people who knew what they were doing so I could stand out of the way and let them get their jobs done.
We talk about everything, and I will give him my reasoning and thing, but basically basketball, he's left it to me to make those decisions.
This is what fuddles me about the Reinsdorf ownership, is that all of this was going on beneath him here. And I never get the feeling he was so hands-on in certain times when he should have been. He always sat back and said, nope, this is Krause's baby.
Jerry Reinsdorf's hands-off approach, I think did a lot of damage to the Bulls in the fact that at some point you have to take responsibility of your franchise. I think that approach was the demise of the Chicago Bulls.
He's a loyal guy, and he believes that Jerry Krause did a lot to build that dynasty, and he's not going to just cast him aside, not even for Michael Jordan.
In the end, you lost them both, Jordan and Jackson, because Reinsdorf refused to ever side with the other two. He had to side and be loyal to Jerry Krause to the end.
Jerry Reinsdorf loyalty is a most admirable trait, but also a weakness in this case, because it resulted in the demolition of this team.
Michael Jordan, the best and most influential player in the NBA, could have come down to earth and kept the Bulls together.
Michael Jordan is responsible for demonizing Jerry Krause.
For all his gifts and his glibness,
Michael Jordan is still at heart the guy who picks on the kid at the back of the bus sometimes. And Jerry Krause was that kid for many years for him.
One day we were on the bus, and Michael said from the back of the bus, "Jerry, you can go fishing tomorrow. They got a lot of lakes out here." He said, don't worry about it if you don't catch anything. You can always eat the bait."
Jerry Krause was first and foremost Michael Jordan's enemy. Michael Jordan is everyone's hero. You gotta hate Jerry Krause.
Jordan had a personal animus for Krause that was almost contemptible. And that boiled over into a friction between players and the general manager that shouldn't have been there, didn't need to be there.
Let's face it, Michael Jordan's the reason the Bulls won. But Krause did a few things that helped, and it wouldn't have killed him to give him a little bit of credit, but Michael just couldn't find it in his heart to do that.
When we traded Charles Oakley for Bill Cartwright, Michael came out and blasted me personally and blasted the organization and said we never should have traded Charles.
Michael could have made it easier by just, being nice to the guy every once in a while. But hey, let's face it, Michael was the man. No matter what he did, he could do no wrong in the eyes of his teammates and the fans.
Michael had so much power with his teammates, with his coaching staff, that if he had made the move to come back, it's likely that other guys would have followed.
I mean, I would have stayed if Michael was there. I definitely would have stayed.
I think Jordan's retirement hurt the Bulls the most. If Jordan stays, Phil Jackson stays, Scottie Pippen stays, the team stays intact, because Jordan, he's the man in Chicago. He makes that thing go.
Had Michael Jordan been there, the demise would have never occurred. They never would have gone from a world championship to 15, 17 victories in one season. You can attribute it almost totally to Michael Jordan's departure.
There you have it, the top 5 reasons you can't blame Jerry Krause for the demise of the Chicago Bulls. Maybe we changed your mind, maybe we didn't. But if you're still watching this, our guess is we at least made you think of the story in a different light. I'm Brian Kenny. Thanks for watching.
Whew, what a mess. But nothing can be perfect, right? Because, I mean, based off of the success that this Bulls team had during that run, it was so great. They were so great on the court. Something had to go wrong. Nothing's ever perfect. So it just so happens for this, for them, the fault, was in their front office and the relationship with the coach and the players. So I'm just going to address some of the main parties that were involved in all of this, kind of give my 2 cents, pros and cons, why they could have been blamed and maybe why they shouldn't have been blamed. And I'll leave it there, and you all can discuss it down in the comments. So the main entity that generally gets blamed, I'll go with first, of course, none other than Jerry Krause. I do think he is a big part of the blame, because the fact that he felt like he needed so much credit from the general manager position, even though he was, other than Michael, it was all him. But the fact that he needed to get so much credit, or felt like he needed to get the credit outwardly and not just, inwardly amongst, from the owner, from the players, the coach, and his peers, other GMs around the league. But he needed to go through the media and get it openly. That didn't help. And then for whatever reason, whatever got him and Phil just kind of got into it, and whatever it is he was doing with Phil, because that is the one thing in my view that could have definitely kept this, was Phil. But whatever Jerry Krause, whatever role he played in that, I think that was the biggest part. Not just him being a jerk or whatever, this or that, but for whatever reason, him getting Phil to agree to not come back after the 98 season, even though Jerry Reinsdorf asked Phil to come back, I think that's the biggest reason we can blame Jerry Krause, is because he basically ran Phil out. Phil had enough. And obviously Phil has his own role as well because, well, let me go back to Jerry just to say why part of the reason why you can't. I mean, you can hold him at fault, but then again, you can't because once again, outside of Michael, he built it's all him, including Phil Jackson. You know, so he's the one that brings Phil in as an assistant under Doug Collins when Doug Collins started in the 86-87 season. So it's like you can blame Jerry, but then you can't blame Jerry because he had so much to do and was so responsible for the success of the team. It's just crazy how it works out that way, where the guy who's so responsible outside of Michael also just happens to have a personality that's going to end up, rubbing so many people the wrong way. And now moving on to Phil, obviously we can give Phil his due from a coaching perspective, where he was able to step in and get the team in that right mental frame, because they had the physical talent and going and all those things I think were there, but the mental part and then the system and getting Michael to buy in, which would get all the other players to buy in. That's the thing that you can really credit Phil for. But then on the other hand, he, in doing that with the team and the camaraderie amongst the team, it included turning them against, the front office, aka Jerry Krause. So Phil has his reasons, or he has his blame as well in that part. Like, he didn't have to take it there, but he chose to, and you can't fault it for the success that took place on the court. Whatever it was that he used to motivate the team, it led to success on the court. And Phil's the one person I think that could have saved this. Because if Phil stays, Michael stays. It's clear Mike didn't want to retire. Because if he wanted to retire, he would have retired, shortly after the season or whatever. But he waited until January because it was the lockout season. So he waited till January. And from what I remember, he was going to a lot of the meetings with the owners to try to, get the league going, get the games going. So it was clear he wanted to play, but he was going to play for Phil. And Michael is, that type of competitor where, and obviously, you all just watched it, so you saw how the relationship he had with Jerry, or lack thereof. So in my view, if Phil was gone and Mike came back to play, Mike would see that as losing to Jerry Krause, where, Jerry Krause ran off his coach and Mike still played for him in a way, in a roundabout way. And I can see how Mike would take that as losing to Jerry Krause, and we already know how Mike is with losing. So he would rather retire, even though he still wants to play, he would rather retire than allow Jerry Krause to feel like, he got the best of him in that Phil Jackson, or in the coaching situation. So Mike retires. So that's why I go back to with Phil. If Phil comes back, which Jerry Reinsdorf said that he went to Phil and offered him, the chance to come back. If Phil comes back, Michael comes back. If Michael comes back, I don't care what anybody says. You're not going to tell me they don't get Scotty to either sign that. I mean, it was a sign and trade that sent him to Houston. So either that same deal or a similar deal or a 1-year deal, some way to get Scotty paid to get him to stay for that one, at least one more year if Mike is there. I'm sorry, you're not convincing me that Phil's there, Mike's there, and Scotty's not going to be there. I'm sorry, I'm not buying it. Not buying it. So I think Phil was the main linchpin that fell, that caused everything else to fall. Because Mike was not going to play for another coach. He wasn't taking the L to Krause. And then once Mike is gone, Pippen wouldn't have a reason to stay anyway, and then the front office would just not keep that team together anyway. So Phil, in my view, was the main linchpin that once it was pulled, like, you're playing Jenga or something, that's the block you pull and the thing just crumbles, was Phil. Now with Mike, obviously Mike was so responsible for the success on the court. I mean, how much you really gonna hold him to blame for, it not being able to stay together? If he was willing to take the L to Krause and play for another coach, Would Scotty still have stayed? Would the rest of the team still have stayed? Or would they have been able to build something around himself and Scotty? Who knows? But we know the way Mike is built, the way he's conditioned. He was never going to play for another coach. And Jerry Krause understood that. Jerry Reinsdorf understood that. So they had to understand. Like when Krause and Phil came to that understanding that the 98 season was going to be his last year, Jerry Krause had to understand, yeah, that's also going to be Mike's last year. He's not coming back. He had to understand that. So I don't put a lot of the blame on Mike for that reason, because it's just in his nature. It's just how he is. He wasn't going to play for another coach. So to be honest, in my view, the person who I put the most blame on for the breakup or the ending of the Bulls in '98, to where they couldn't come back for at least one more year. They couldn't at least lose to get, to end it. They broke up, before they could even lose. In my view, Jerry Reinsdorf. Because all of this is festering under him, and he's the owner. At the end of the day, he's the one cutting the checks for everybody. He's signing the checks for everyone. And if he had stepped in between Krause and Phil Jackson and kind of didn't allow that to get so toxic, the relationship could have been extended, in my view. That's where I think carries the most blame. Because once again, Phil was that key. Once Phil's gone, it's a wrap. Mike's not coming back. And at that point, the team's not going to keep Scotty or the rest of the other players. It's a wrap. So Phil was that main block. Once Phil was gone, it was going to be a wrap. So Jerry Reinsdorf, I think, is the biggest responsible, because he could have somewhat mended that relationship or not allowed it to get so toxic between Krause and Phil, so that they at least could have, worked together in some kind of capacity just to keep the team together. I blame Jerry Reinsdorf for the demise of the Bulls. What do you think? You agree, disagree on my points or on some of the points that were made in the video? You know what to do. Go ahead and head down to that comment section and let me know. Hit that thumbs up video if you like it. Subscribe if you haven't already. More highlight videos on the way. Peace. Peace.
I don't have to do this. I'm only doing it because it is who I am. That's how I played the game. That was my mentality. If you don't want to play that way, don't play that way. Break.